So tonight is season premiere of season 4, Mystery at Blind Frog Ranch.
That is Chad Ollinger, a star of Discovery's Mystery at Blind Frog Ranch. But right now he's not on a ranch. He's in a Las Vegas jail facing an open murder charge after his cellmate was found dead the day after Christmas. Now, authorities say the death resulted from a violent jail fight weeks before he was set to be released. And right now, new details from an arrest report are shedding light on what police say Ollinger told them after the killing, including a claim that may raise serious questions about his mental state. We're going to be discussing key questions in this case with a Las Vegas criminal defense attorney. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. By the way, there's something that we use here at Law&Crime that could be very, very useful to you. It's called Truth Finder. It's the powerful public records search service that we use to do research on the people involved in our stories. You want to talk about a useful resource? You plug in a name, you get address information, you get criminal history, and let me just say, that can give you some peace of mind. Truth Finder is one of the largest public records search services in the United States, and with a paid subscription, you can get access to unlimited reports about almost anyone, and that includes looking up registered sex offenders in your area too. So stay informed, stay safe, check public records with Truth Finder now at truthfinder.com/LC Sidebar. So you may have heard of this guy, Chad Ollinger, one of the stars of Discovery Channel's Mystery at Blind Frog Ranch. And according to Las Vegas Metro PD, he was sitting in a Las Vegas jail on a contempt charge. And then, just one day after Christmas, guards, apparently doing a routine check, found his cellmate, 42-year-old Christopher Kelly, lying motionless on the floor of the cell, dead from what police call apparent blunt force injuries. So Ollinger is now charged with open murder after police claim the two got into a physical altercation that escalated into Kelly's violent death. Now you might be saying, well, what's open murder? We're going to get to that. Very important here. But here's the detail that changes absolutely everything in this story. Because according to jail records, Ollinger had just been sentenced on that contempt charge days earlier. When was he scheduled to be released? January 12th, 2026. So he was almost out. He was weeks from freedom. And now he's accused of throwing it all away in a violent fight behind bars. So we got to take a step back. We got to make sure everybody's on the same page here because this story has different layers to it. I think it's all important. It all starts with this man named Chad Ollinger. Okay, you might know him from TV. He's been on the Discovery Channel show Mystery at Blind Frog Ranch for 5 seasons, chasing treasure with his dad in Utah. It's a real rugged, adventurous type. But then you go to this past October, and Ollinger gets picked up in Nevada. Now, it wasn't for anything violent. It was for a contempt of court charge, basically failing to show up for something else in another state. This is according to Deadline, basically an alleged fugitive. Now, we can't confirm exactly what that was all about and what was he a fugitive for, but what we do know is he gets booked into the Clark County Detention Center out in Las Vegas. So he's just doing his time, right? A judge sentenced him on December 18th on that contempt charge. Paperwork shows that he was scheduled to be released on January 12th, 2026. He's got less than 3 weeks left in his sentence. And then on the night of December 26th, so the day after Christmas, corrections officers are doing their normal rounds. In fact, according to Fox 5 Vegas, they reviewed an arrest report, which we're going to talk about more in a minute, and it apparently indicated that an officer was making the medication rounds. They look into the cell, they see a man, later identified as Kelly, lying on the floor, motionless. So they apparently rush in, reportedly find these brutal blunt force injuries. Apparently there's blood on his face. They try to save him, but it's too late. He's pronounced dead right there in the cell. And the only other person in that cell, Chad Ollinger. So Las Vegas police, they get called in. Ollinger allegedly said, by the way, that Kelly was, quote, not feeling well. According to Fox 5, when investigators start taking photos of the scene and they try to take photos of Ollinger, he allegedly says, good luck cracking the case. Now, they apparently pieced together that a physical fight broke out between Kelly and Ollinger inside that locked cell. In fact, Fox 5 also reporting that nearby inmates said they heard a fight, heard someone screaming. One inmate allegedly said he heard someone yell, "They're beating me, they're killing me, help me." Now, the result? Ollinger, the reality TV star, again, weeks from freedom, is now rebooked and charged with open murder. So that's the straight timeline, or the apparent timeline from investigators. A guy serving a short stint suddenly finds himself facing a murder charge that could put him away, maybe for life, all over this alleged jailhouse fight that turned deadly. But according to newly released police documents, this is new. What happened after this interaction and what Ollinger allegedly told investigators, that now may become a central issue in how this case is ultimately prosecuted and defended. And we're going to get to that in just a moment. But that basic timeline leaves a lot of questions. Why did it happen? What set it off? How does a guy who was literally counting the days to his release now end up in a fight that is apparently so vicious it leaves another man dead? Well, with an arrest report coming into focus, we are learning how Ollinger himself allegedly explained what happened and why he says he did what he allegedly did. All right, so to help us try and answer some of these questions, I want to bring on a special guest, Las Vegas criminal defense attorney Michael Troiano. Michael, thank you so much for taking the time. Really appreciate it. Open murder. It's not in every state. It's an interesting charge. For our audience, what does that mean practically? What is the strategy there for a prosecutor to charge open murder?
Sure. So typically when accused of any sort of homicide in the state of Nevada, the prosecution will charge, as you just stated, open murder. And essentially that gives them a gambit all the way through trial and even closing arguments to argue different degrees of murder. So we have first-degree murder, we have second-degree murder here in the state of Nevada, then we have voluntary manslaughter, and then we have involuntary manslaughter. So those are typically the gambit of which the arguments will be made, and it gives them that freedom to run the case how they choose.
Let me just make clear about that. Are you saying they don't have to, before trial, when they're presenting to a jury, say this is a specific degree of murder? They give them options, and at the end in the deliberations, the jury can choose which one they believe?
Yeah, I mean, they can charge each one of those individually, and then it's up to them to make that particular argument. So let's say they're saying it's first-degree murder, it was intentional, with malice aforethought, and the defense on the other side is saying, no, this was voluntary manslaughter, it was a heat of the passion, in the moment sort of crime, and that can be hashed out all the way up until the closing arguments, absolutely.
Does that make a defense attorney's job more difficult? I mean, typically, you know, in other states, when you know what the degree is, you know what the argument is, defense attorneys can say prosecutors didn't meet these elements. But when you have this gamut of open murder, is it more difficult to defend?
I mean, sure, in a perfect world, I'd like to just have one specific allegation and hone in on that. But I don't really look at it as a negative. I look at it as we are framing our argument, whether that's just full on self-defense, not guilty, or he didn't do it. You know, you got the wrong guy. Obviously, those are completely different types of defenses other than arguing what the lack of elements are. And yes, I've been in cases where the state has argued first-degree murder and we have argued self-defense, that it wasn't a whodunit. It was obviously my client, but they were fully justified under the law. And you really have to just have a good conversation with your client about the realistic elements of the facts, the evidence, and showing credibility to the jury in order to present that, because you might have a client who says it's full on self-defense and none of the evidence lines up. And you got to tell them like, hey, we can go that route, but if we lose credibility with the jury, we know the state is arguing first-degree murder based upon the evidence. We might have a better shot at quote unquote splitting the baby, if you will, and arguing voluntary manslaughter, that, yeah, you weren't fully justified in the homicide under these facts, but this wasn't premeditated. There was some sort of heat of the passion, and which at that point you have much less exposure as far as prison time is concerned.
Now, before we go any further into this, there is new information from an arrest report that was just reported by Fox 5 in Las Vegas that we got to talk about, so KVVU, because it adds a major new potential layer to this case. So according to that document, police say Ollinger told them that he has what he described as a, quote, supernatural ability to read people. That his ability told him his cellmate, Christopher Kelly, was a predator. So these are the allegations. The report claims that Ollinger told police, quote, if I know something about somebody that's bad, I take care of it. And that he felt he had a, quote, responsibility to identify predators, even though, according to police, he admitted he had no actual proof that Kelly was a pedophile in any way. But he allegedly told investigators that the killing was spontaneous, it wasn't planned. He said that when he begins to, quote, know things, something snaps. Police said he also told them he felt no emotion afterward, didn't care if he went to prison for the rest of his life. This is all he allegedly said. And according to Fox 5, he also claimed that he suffered from memory loss from some sort of past trauma, but he can't remember certain things. He confirmed he didn't have a mental disease or mental illness or take any kind of medication, that he was never provided a diagnosis of memory loss, that he also claims he didn't take any drugs or ingest any alcohol, so he seemed to indicate that he must have done something to Kelly that was pretty traumatic for him to not remember exactly what happened. Michael, that's a lot to get through from a defense perspective. What do we make of that?
All right, you're right. There's a lot to get through, but we'll unpack it together. So I have to be honest, I've never heard of this guy. I've never heard of the show that he was on when you guys reached out to have me come on. So, I mean, just looking at his photos, and you can't always judge a book by its cover, but he definitely looked a little erratic. I don't know, maybe he's cool as a cucumber on the show. Just the premise of the show was kind of interesting, weird, like going into caves and looking for gold, etc. This isn't his first run-in with the law either. He had other issues, I believe, in Texas. At some point, his family reported him missing in New Mexico. And if you're reporting an adult child that's, not mentally challenged, if you will, or has some other kind of issues going on as missing, there's probably drugs, alcohol, a combination of both, as well as mental health challenges. Now, again, I don't know any of this for a fact, but it seems as if he had a lot of issues going on. And that's just what's being reported in the news. And the information you're giving me now, which is certainly new, regarding his supposed confession to the police. So let's just bake in the cake for this moment, for television purposes, the assumptions. Let's assume they read him his Miranda rights. Let's assume they followed all the protocol, and that this whole statement and confession is going to get into evidence. And that's a big assumption, because on a defense standpoint, you need to challenge all that, especially when it seems pretty clear if he's good at reading people, which, we all like to claim we are, but not to the point where you're going to murder somebody with no provocation, if you will. There's got to be something there. So let's assume that statement gets in, and I'm the defense attorney for the moment based on these very limited set of facts. Absent some sort of change of story or some video evidence that the other person initiated it and this was sort of a self-defense thing, I mean, you're really kind of boxed in. We're talking either not guilty by reason of insanity, which is still an extremely, extremely high burden to overcome. It has occurred in recent years. I'm aware of at least one case. The Clark County PD's office was very successful and got that. But when I've had murder cases and clients or their families have engaged me in that conversation, some people tend to think that not guilty by reason of insanity is some sort of get out of jail or get out of prison free card. That's not the case. Yeah, congratulations, you're not guilty, but again, by reason of insanity. So you're not going straight to a prison or in the Nevada Department of Corrections here, as we call it. You're going to a mental health facility. And trust me, if it's to the point where you can convince a jury of 12 that you're not guilty by reason of insanity, you're going to be staying in that mental health facility for an extremely long time, possibly a lifetime. So there's that aspect of it. And then you also have the ability possibly to be found guilty or enter a plea of guilty, but mentally incompetent or mentally challenged, excuse me, if you will, in regards to that. And what that really does is you still go to a prison, but you are provided treatment and other things that maybe typical inmates that were getting sent up there are not.
Okay, so let me unpack that now from what you said, and I think that's a really good analysis of it. Let's first deal with insanity. Okay, what is the test in Nevada for insanity? Is it the McNaughton test, right, where somebody doesn't appreciate the wrongfulness of their actions, they don't understand the nature of what they did? Is that what you're dealing with? And does any part of that statement or any part of the fact pattern that you currently know, because obviously you don't have the case file, potentially fit into that? So what's the test? What's the standard? And anything you think there could be something that would fit into it?
Correct. So you have to prove from the defense side beyond a reasonable doubt, essentially, or the state has to counteract that. And you have to bring in experts that are going to medically evaluate the client on the defense side. The state is also allowed to have their counter experts as well. So it's pretty open and broad as far as the discovery is concerned, allowing them to be able to evaluate that on both sides. So you can't just come in and say, hey, my client's insane, and bring up a doctor after, and there's this trial by ambush, if you will. Both sides are going to be exchanging all of those reports, and you basically said it. Are they understanding their conduct? Appreciate their actions? Was the conduct wrong? And just because you have a thought or a feeling that somebody is bad, and it sounds like he's kind of screwed that standard, if you will, because if I'm taking your words correctly, he's saying he knew this person or could read him well and therefore felt it was his duty to murder him. That's not going to meet the insanity standard here in Nevada, nor anywhere across the nation. I mean, to give you an example of that case that I just mentioned that was successful in Nevada, which is exceedingly rare, and I'm kind of screwing up the dissertation here because it wasn't my case, it was the Clark County Public Defender's Office, but essentially the client, I believe, murdered his father, and he was under the belief that his father was like a demon from another galaxy, and he could not appreciate the nature of his actions, or the wrongfulness of his actions of taking a life. He was not aware of what he was doing at all. Here, it seems like he was like, you know what, I can read people. This is a bad dude. It's my job to take care of it. Forget the legalities.
That's a really good point. I mean, that's the classic law school example. Like, you don't understand that you're killing a human being in a sense, right? I mean, whereas whatever your reason for knowingly or intentionally killing another person, like, that doesn't matter for the insanity defense. Although I will ask you, there are issues that don't mount to an insanity defense that could say, hey, the mental state of the defendant may affect intent, may affect the elements of like first-degree murder or second-degree murder, right? Isn't there times when mental health, mental state can affect whether someone is actually charged with the highest crime or whether or not it could be downgraded to, let's say, second-degree murder or manslaughter, right?
Sure. And like we said, we started with, it's open murder. So they're going to be charged with essentially everything. And then it's going to be up to the prosecution based upon the evidence and the flow of the trial of really what they want to argue for at the actual closing arguments. And those sort of mental deficiencies are going to be brought into play on both sides. But at the end of the day, absent, very specific facts that downgrade that from a first degree to a second degree or some sort of manslaughter, it's going to be a very difficult challenge for the defense.
Well, I also have to say, this death occurring in a jail cell is very confined, very isolated. It's different than a case that happens on the outside where you might suggest that there are alternative suspects or alternative theories. If he's alone in the jail cell, it does make me wonder, could there be an argument potentially for some sort of self-defense? If you hear inmates saying they heard an altercation, there was a struggle, I'd imagine it also depends upon whether or not Ollinger sustained any kind of injuries, or I don't know if there would be cameras, possibly, but is that something that we might be talking about too?
The jail is heavily cameraed, but I wouldn't be surprised, depending on where it was, specifically like in the cell or what specific cell it was, that it's not on film. I feel like at this point, and although it's early, we would probably know if it was on some sort of film or recording. But I think one of the points you just made earlier makes a lot of sense. If there are independent witnesses, and typically other guards or other cellmates that are either in the cell that I witnessed it firsthand, or were down the hallway and heard some sort of struggle or argument or whatever it may be, that would be beneficial for the defense to look into that, because it's one of those classic scenarios. Listen, forget what my client said. It doesn't make any sense. Forget all that. We've got Billy and Tom and Jim right here at the cell next door. They heard the deceased screaming, "I'm going to kill you if you don't get off my chair, if you don't do this," whatever it may be. And then the struggle ensued. If you can elicit that sort of testimony and evidence in a case, then there's a lot better chance at either voluntary manslaughter or potentially a not guilty verdict in self-defense.
And by the way, just one before we move forward, the idea that this guy was going to be released so soon and now is caught up in a murder case, right? I mean, does that aspect from a defense point of view say, hey, this says something about his mental state, this says something about would he do it, would he not do it? Because that's what's so strange. He was about to be released on a contempt charge, and now, like, potentially he could be facing the rest of his life in prison. Does that factor into it at all?
Sure. We're not going to escape the mental health issue here. There's clearly some sort of mental health issue. And whether there's people that are fans of the show and actually had the ability to watch him and got that vibe from him, if you will, or based on what we know early on, he said to the police, and then add on what you're saying now. It's like, listen, nobody wants to be in jail. Like, I always say that to my clients, like, hey, this isn't a fun place to be. But at the same time, if there's light at the end of the tunnel, and you said he's a few weeks, not even weeks, basically at this point. Yeah, I mean, just shy of 2 weeks as we're recording here, that he was due to be released on a non-serious, contempt charge, and he gets in this kind of altercation. Now, don't get me wrong, jails are a dangerous place, but there's a significant difference, at least here in Nevada, between the dangers in the Clark County Detention Center and jail, although dangerous, I wouldn't want to be there, to be clear, and going to High Desert State Prison. And so to put himself in that position, you don't hear about too many murders occurring at the detention center as compared to a lot more extreme violence up in High Desert and other Nevada Department of Corrections, because up there, everybody's, in there for decades, possibly.
I want to follow up on something. So I want your take on this. So Ollinger, like we've been talking about, he wasn't just any other inmate. He was a TV personality. And this show, it presents a very specific image, because according to Discovery Channel's own profile, this isn't just some guy. We're talking about a family enterprise. So his father, to give everybody a little backstory here, Dwayne Ollinger, is the central figure. The network says that he made a fortune as a high-risk oil contractor in Amarillo, Texas, sold his company, poured everything into this wildcat gold mining operation in Utah, the Blind Frog Ranch. And the show's whole premise is this grand, almost mythical adventure. Dwayne is seemingly convinced that there is a famous lost treasure that's hidden in the caverns under the property. Chad, the son, is portrayed as this rugged, fearless risk taker, the one climbing through tight caves, diving into underwater caverns to find all of it. It's a story of family, it's a story of fortune, frontier spirit. I do wonder, if this case progresses to a trial, does any of that come in, and how does the celebrity aspect of it factor into it? I mean, maybe even in jury selection.
Sure. And that's actually the first thing I thought of, is the jury selection portion of it, because as far as what he did previously regarding that show, at this moment, I don't see any specific relevance, but maybe the prosecution will find relevance and they will try to get some of that in, or the defense, or both. But this seems like a very random crime. They didn't know each other. And as we've gone over in great detail earlier, he confessed that essentially he got bad vibes from this guy and felt that he had to take him out. But let's start with what we know as fact, is that I guess he's, quasi-famous. He was on a reality TV show. So I think absolutely, in order to avoid any appeal issues, both the prosecution and the defense are going to want to ask during voir dire the potential panel of the juries if they know him. And that's actually true for any case, regardless of somebody's fame. I mean, you could have somebody who, lives under a cave for the last 30 years. They get charged with a crime. They're going to ask, hey, do you know, they'll go off the list of the witness list on both the defense and the prosecution, read names, officers' names, investigators' names, eyewitnesses' names, you name it. They'll ask even, do you know either the defense attorneys? Do you know any of the prosecution? Do you know the defendant? So regardless of status, that question is going to be asked. And then I guess we'll find out how popular the show really was, at least in Clark County.
Yeah. And also, I mean, you think about what else could come into evidence. I have to talk about this, because to understand who Chad Ollinger was before this, you have to look at the year leading up to it. We got to talk about 2024, because by all accounts, by public records, it was a very turbulent year for him. We want to rewind for a second, because according to an indictment from Potter County, Texas, and local reporting from KFDA News, Channel 10, Ollinger's legal troubles really started in November of 2024. Police in Amarillo, Texas, say they tried to pull him over, and according to their account, he took off on a motorcycle, eventually ditched it, and then was fleeing on foot. Now, he was later arrested. He was charged with evading arrest. A grand jury indicted him on that charge in January of 2025. In February, jail records from Gray County, Texas show he was booked again, this time for driving with an invalid license. And then things took an even stranger turn in the summer. This is what we talked about before. In July, according to a report like from WAFB and KMR, KCIT News, and police records, Ollinger's own family reported him missing in New Mexico. He was entered into the national database as a missing and endangered person. Now, he was located shortly after in Albuquerque, but the circumstances of why he was missing, they were never publicly detailed. You know, Michael, from our perspective, as we're trying to understand it, it's pretty alarming. But again, going back to the legal case, does any of that come into this?
Again, we're dealing with a very small amount of information, so it's hard to give an expert opinion. I would say this, let's start with the basis of what kind of prior criminal activities can get into evidence. And so when we're specifically talking from the defense standpoint, if the defendant took the stand in his own defense, then what is fair game under Nevada law is going to be any felony conviction within the last 10 years. So if any of those cases resulted in a felony conviction, then yes, the prosecution can ask him about it, introduce the judgment of conviction, and the jury would be made aware he's had prior legal troubles regarding that. If those did not result in felony convictions, then it's very unlikely that those are going to get into evidence. The only other way I could possibly see that getting into evidence is if the state filed what's called a motion for prior bad acts. But typically when you have a motion for prior bad acts, there needs to be some sort of nexus and relevance to the acts and accusations in this case as compared to whatever those prior acts, whether charged criminally and or convicted or uncharged in some circumstances. So I don't see a nexus other than his unstable mental health, which is pretty clear. So based on all of that, it's really going to depend on, was it a felony or not?
So you make a great point. I mean, in a traditional case, a defendant wouldn't want any of this coming in. I mean, it'd be prejudicial to his case. But if you're talking about potential mental health and erratic behavior and strange circumstances, would a defense attorney in any way try to get some of this introduced to say, hey, listen, look what we're dealing with here? This is a guy who's struggling for quite some time. And is there a way that they would do it?
And that'd be on the flip side, right? The defense also has the opportunity to file prior bad acts and get those in, regardless if it's his own client or not. Now, typically, you're not going to get a whole lot of pushback from the prosecution if you're bringing in bad acts of your own client, but there is legal analysis regarding whether or not that comes in. And to answer your question more directly, I think that would be in a circumstance in which if they were clearly going for not guilty by reason of insanity.
Yeah, this is a weird one. Let's see where it progresses. Michael Troiano, thank you so much for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Happy New Year.
And that is all we have for you right now here on Sidebar, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow me on X or Instagram. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.